Oh, yeah, it rains, it's out. I'm sure, but it would be, because I could hear it outside the house. Because it must be loud. But then you don't hear it, can you? So you used to go to sleep ago.
Okay, so why don't we backtrack just a little bit? We're going back and forth regarding the case of the teacher who wants to quit mid-year, which is going to cause financial loss for the school where he's working, right? Yeah. Yeah, you're going to take some of the students with him. Now, we saw machlokes between the Shach and the Ritva, as far as if a person contracts with a Kinyan to work for someone, then he can't back out. The Shach disagrees. The Shach says that even if you have a contract, a person is allowed to resign. And the reason is because you can't obligate a person to be subjugated to you. That's the argument. So we see that even if a person is under contract, there's still a machlokas as to whether he's allowed to resign from that position. Amnam. So I think we'll just backtrack to Oath Bays. Amnam benidon didan shahamalamed lo rotza lavod betalmud Torah zev rotza lelamed betalmud Torah acher. Here the case is where the teacher wants to resign, not so that he can be a man of leisure, because that was the Shach's argument. How could you compel a person to work? The Torah says that you cannot subjugate the Jewish people. The Jewish people have a right to be free, and God is like insistent that the Jews never be enslaved. But let's say a guy says, I'm not resigning so that I can be free of the slavery of work. I'm resigning because I want to go work for someone else. And so therefore he's going to be subjugated to somebody else in a work arrangement. Yesh ladun hagrash Reb Shlomo Kluger. So then we should take a look at the Chachma Shlomo B'Zelashona. He says, Nira lefi aniyos daiti davar chadash. He says, it seems to me, that even though the Gemara says that a day laborer can quit even midday, and even though it creates an inconvenience, remember we said that the worker can always say, sorry, you'll have to find somebody else. Hainu rakim eno niskar la'acher, o after efshalamachar o loyoma uchra ye niskar la'amrinan da'az isra, v'hashtahu de isra. He says that that's only if he's quitting in order not to go work for somebody else. Even though it's always possible that after a person resigns, he could look for new work. But if the purpose of his resigning is to immediately contract with somebody else, the Maharshal says that he's not allowed to do that. Aval ad heina haya kasher ve'en arotza liot eved la'adam. Because the argument that the reason why we are so liberal as to giving the workers rights to quit midday is because we can't make a person into an eved, right? But if he's immediately going to start working for somebody else, avalim ba'oto ma'amad maskir atzmo la'acher, im kain sof sof osa atzmo lepol v'havi eved. But if he's immediately going to work for somebody else, and that's the very reason why he's resigning, so then he doesn't have a right to do that. Because then because there you're not compelling a person to be enslaved to you. He says, because since he always has the option of being a man of leisure, if he chooses to resign to work for no one, so then you're not making him into an eved. But if it's clear in his own mind that he's only resigning from you mid-contract to work for somebody else, The Maharshal says he's not allowed to do that. And then he continues, because he also deals with the case of a teacher. He says, Malamed havi leidin davar ha'avad k'mefurish b'ramasim in shin lamed gimel, that a malamed causes significant financial loss. It's not that a worker can say to you, go find somebody else. It'll be easy for you to find someone else. No, because a malamed is a specialized kind of laborer, and therefore it's going to create significant loss. Ordinarily, the malamed bikinyan vada ina yochel lachzor bo, and that's certainly true if he's under contract, meaning they made a kinyan when they hired him. Daharei hashach hevi deos hakadmonim b'chol pol bikinyan eino chozer, va'after sham hevi gam cholkin mikol makom nira de modim b'dover ha'avid bikinyan l'kuli alma ina yochel lachzor bo. He says, because even though the shach brings opinions that are more liberal, that hold that you're allowed to resign even when you're under contract, but that's only when your resignation will not cause significant loss to the company. But if it causes significant loss to the company and you're under contract, that, says the Maharshal, I think is not permitted. And therefore, based on all of the above, when you give a signing bonus or whatever they call that, in other words, if at the time of hiring him, you gave him cash as a way of showing him consideration for entering into a contract, so then, and he wants to quit mid-year, he doesn't have the right to do so. That's the opinion of the Maharshal. And even though there are opinions that may disagree with that, it's important to know that this is one opinion. Now, let us continue. Va'afta kasav harama, the melamed hachozer bo, mikri davar ha'avud v'davar avud eni yachol lachzer bo echad kablan ve'echad poel. He says, the Rama writes that just like a kablan is not allowed to resign mid-job. Now, remember, what's a kablan? You hire him to do a job, not a certain term of time, but rather to complete a specific job. So I hire a guy to build me a chair. So I've already invested in him. He's already invested. Neither party is allowed to terminate the contract mid-job. And the reason is because that causes financial loss to both parties. And the same thing, therefore, is true, says the Rama, that if a poel is going to cause significant loss, you can't retract. He can't retract. Remember, the Shach disagrees with that, but at least we see that the Rama holds that way also. What's the hefsid? What's the loss? It's that the child's going to be without a teacher. In other words, if you really can't find a replacement for this Rebbe, and even if you could, but he's going to be subpar to the current Rebbe, that's a loss that can never be recovered. However, if you could find a viable substitute, so then he could quit mid-contract. So, bottom line is, it depends how replaceable this teacher is. If he could be easily replaced by somebody who could fill in for him and do a satisfactory job in educating the students, then you could replace him. So what's the case over here? The hamanahal toin shuhu malamid miyuchad ve'en lo sheni me'achar v'shitas halimud b'talmud Torah zeh hu miyuchadet v'lo kol moreh yachol lahatim lazeh v'rak hu hamumche. The principal of the school is claiming that I can't find a replacement. Why? Because this is a specialized method of teaching. Either it's like a Montessori school, or there's different ways of teaching, especially in Eretz Yisrael. I forget the Zilberstein method. You heard of the Zilberstein method? Where did you say?
You see them covered in the old city. They have the Zilberstein.
That's right. That's right. That's what I'm saying. You're familiar with it. Do any of your grandkids do it?
No, but people rave about it.
that
Yeah.
they learn, they sing everything, there's a truck to everything, and they retain information.
Yeah, right. So anyway, so it's a specialized method of education. It's not so easy to find a Rebbe who's going to be able to do this. This particular Rebbe is like the Pied Piper. He's the reason why people signed up their kids for this particular school, because they know they're going to get this Rebbe. Kol shekain diyochel lachzer bo detoin lo my hifsidecha the kosav moran v'imlo nenas v'chazar bo im hayamotze poalim acherim liskor kishasachar es elu v'akshav enu motze socher alehan o mata'an. Hold on a second. Let me just make sure I'm understanding this. Kol shekain diyochel lachzer bo. Then the argument that he's making now is, then he could resign. The toin lo, my hafsadich, in what way have I caused you loss? The harei kasavorn, because the Machaber writes, v'im lo nanas v'chazar bo, that if a person is not in a case of onus, in other words, there's no emergency that he has to leave the job, and he just decides to quit, im hayamotze po'alim acherim liskor, keshesachar es elu v'achshav eno motze, if the employer could have found other workers at the time when he hired him, but now in midterm he can't find other workers, socher alehan o mata'an. So I'm not sure what that phrase means. The Sma explains la'afuke imgam mitechila keshesacharan lo hayamotze po'alam achem l'sochem l'malachazu delo mikri gormo hezek to hazulosam gam kein nasalo hezek ayin sham v'chein kasav hashach. The argument that he's making is as follows. The only time that an employer can claim that you're causing me a loss is that at the time that I hired you, I had a pool of potential candidates that I could have hired other than yourself. The fact that I chose you and excluded the others from being hired, and now you're quitting midterm, now I can't find those guys anymore. He says that's the reason why a person has a valid claim. I guess we should probably take a look at that Machaber. But the argument that Rav Shraga is making here is that if this person truly is unique, then he does have a right to resign from his position, because he can always tell the employer, what would you have done if I hadn't accepted the job? You would have been stuck, and you would have been stuck with subpar education anyway. So it's not, in other words, the fact that I'm unique means that I do have a right to go to whichever employer I choose, because it's not like I'm causing you the same kind of loss that I would have caused you had there been other people you could have hired and you rejected them because of me. Do you understand? Am I making sense?
I don't know if that's right either.
Don't you think that the person, even if he's unique, has to fulfill the term and sign up for? Because otherwise, the person's planned for that year that way. And so if he breaks that contract halfway through the year, there is going to be a loss, even if he is unique and there was nobody else who could do that job.
Yes, but he's arguing, here, let me just bring it up.
Well, the students following him in this case you're right. I mean, it's an extra loss.
Okay. So the case that the Machaber is talking about over here is B'davar she'eino avod, is if a worker wants to quit in the middle of a job where there's no financial loss. Let me just share the screen. Aval B'davar ha'avod, but when there's a job that the employee quitting creates a financial loss, kagon pishtan laha'alos mehamishra. Let's say that workers have already put the flax in the soaking vat such that it needs to be removed after a certain specific amount of time, let's say 24 hours. Otherwise, the flax will spoil and you won't be able to turn it into linen. So, and then the workers want to quit mid-job. The guy says, you're causing me financial loss because I was relying on you to take it out. Osha socher chamor lahavi chalilin lameis ola kala v'chayotze bahen, or I hired someone, let's say, to a band for my kid's wedding, and the guy quits, right, 6 hours before the wedding. Echad poil ve'echad kablim eni yochel lachzer. Then you're not allowed to retract on the job. You can't quit because you're causing me this tremendous financial loss. Okay. Unless he truly has an emergency. Let's say he gets sick, or let's say he discovers that his parents passed away. So then he has a legitimate reason to quit. But if he just wants to quit because it's too much of an inconvenience, I don't want to, I found a better offer, then he's not allowed to quit. Now, the imlona, I'm just skipping all of the Ramah. The imlona enas. Let's say there's no onus. The chazarbo, and he pulls out of the job. Im hayamotze poilim acherim liskor kishasachar es elu. If he could have found similar workers when he hired this guy, ba'achshav eno motze, and now he can't find those same workers, socher alehem o mata'an. What does that mean? What do those words mean? Let me just see what that means. Oh, okay. He explains that what this means is that you can promise them as much money as they're asking. In other words, what you can say to them is, I'll pay you double if you finish the job. That's what you're allowed to say to them.
The employee who's resigned.
So the employee says, I need to quit.
Right.
And the guy says, how can you quit on me? He says, well, I don't really enjoy the job so much. And I got to do some other things. So you're allowed to say to him, I'll pay you double, just finish the job. And then when it comes to paying him, you give him the original amount. In other words, because what he's doing to you is he's trying to,
curse you into something.
yeah, right.
And so you play back the same thing.
That's right.
This is Choshen Mishpat, right?
I just had a situation right last week where I had a guy who quoted us for a big order. And then we did all our calculations to send it off to the customer here. And then we asked some questions and then he wrote back, oh, sorry, I made a mistake in the calculation. It's really this price after we had quoted. And it's like a war going on right now. And I said to my team, no problem, I'm steaming from this. When we pay him, I'm gonna go back and pay him the original price, stick it in it. Exactly what this is. Because you can't do that. You can't change once you quoted.
Right.
You can't go back.
You want a relationship with him?
No, I'm gonna be done. That's okay. It's a one-off. It's for Walmart. No,
Well,
I'll lose money if I go based on his new price.
That's surprising a job. When we got the placed the order with him. put a 70% retainer that they want up front.
Right.
It wasn't part of the original quote. They had to go back and speak to the guy and renegotiate.
People do this all the time.
Yeah.
Just getting back to the text that we're studying. So therefore, the of hasma la'afuke im gam mitchila kishesachan lo hayamotze po'alam achim l'sachan l'malakazu. He says, but if at the time when you hired this guy, he was unique, you could not find anyone else to do this job or to do it for that price, the lo mikri gormo hezek, that's not called causing him damage. In other words, if a guy is unique and he's the only person that can do the job and then he quits mid-job, you can't say you caused me significant damage because who else were you going to get to be able to do the job for you? The hazulasam gamkein nasalo hezek, because without having hired me, you also would have been injured by not having this work done. The chen kasav hashach, and the shach says the same argument. In other words, the argument that Rav Shrag is making is that by the principal who's bringing this case, claiming that this guy is unique, you're actually weakening your argument because you're saying, well, who would you have hired? If you're saying there's no one else out there that could do this job, so then that gives him more of a reason, more of a justification to resign. Asher al kein nira diyachol lachzer bo diyachol lomar mai hafsadaticha ki gam im lo hiskamti mitchila lavod lo hayisa malamed kamoni. He says, based on that, a teacher who's truly unique could quit midterm because he could say, who else would you like? It's not like you had anyone else to hire.
How does he know that? You know,
This is what the principal is claiming. The principal's claim is the guy, by him quitting, I can't find anyone to replace him. There's no one else who has this skill other than this guy. And as a result, my school is gonna lose a lot of parents. So I'm gonna lose a lot of money. And so the guy can say, listen, I feel bad for you, but I can't bear that burden of responsibility if I want to quit the job. I'm a free agent. The fact that you can't find anyone else means that when you hired me, you couldn't find anyone else either. Now, to me, it doesn't sound so simple because what if the principal comes back with the counterclaim? You're right. At the time that I hired you, I couldn't have found somebody else. But if I would have known 6 months ago that you were going to quit, I at least could have started training someone to replace you. And for that, I deserved some compensation. So the teacher's arguing justifiably that I didn't cause you a significant loss when at this time when I want to leave, because if you hadn't hired me, you wouldn't have been able to attract all of those parents anyway, because you had no one to replace me. So that's the latest argument that he's making now. Okay, next. All right.
But he's not taking into account that if that's the argument. In other words, I'm unique and I'm not causing you a loss because I've decided. But if there are going to be students who leave the school to go with the teacher, then he is creating a loss.
Yeah, but his argument is you never would have gotten these students without me anyway.
Wow.
So since we
don't know whether the students were there before him or after him, that's a supposition.
Right, but that's the argument. Now, and there's other counter arguments. Even if he is unique, what about the fact that there was no notice given? What about the fact that so much was invested in the infrastructure to have that teacher in place and to have all of the extra students come? I needed to rent extra classrooms. I needed to, get special books and all of these other things because I thought you were going to stay with me for the year.
I find that the definition of unique is quite unusual. I mean,
Okay, yeah. And you're saying no one's irreplaceable. Yeah, there are certain industries though where there are very, very few people who can.
Might be people who are specialists and other people who are not as specialized.
Right.
But I don't know if I would call I mean, and they might be better suited for the jobs because you don't have to do the thing that you would with the person who was maybe not as specialized,
Yeah,
but.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So in the Makor Baruch, he takes issue. He says, "V'lichora nira dekevin dechol hadin sha'amalamed yachol lachzor bo, hu mishum shemalamed bo'ofen miyuchad ve'ein od kamohu, v'lachein yachol liton mai hafsadeticha v'chulei." So on that issue, where the teacher says that I'm unique, so I haven't caused you loss because it's not like you could have hired someone else had you known. Im kein yesh lomar di'imu chozer bo ba'ofen shelo yuchlu klal limtso melamed sheyelamed es hatalmidim o afilu im yimtsu melamed shu melamed be'echos nemucha ma'od. He says, if that in reality is the case, that by his quitting, they won't be able to find another teacher, or they'll find another teacher, but very, very inferior to this teacher. Nira de b'chi agavna lo yichol hamalamed liton mai hapsadeticha, kevin sho yicholim liskal kolponim malamed berama tova, afal pi she'enu miyuchad kamohu v'cha'esiv sidam bazeh. But the principal can still argue, okay, I might not have been able to find a teacher as good as you, but had I known that you were going to quit, I would never have hired you, and I would have hired another kind of teacher that wouldn't be as good as you, but he would have been adequate, like you were just arguing, Doug. B'chol divrei Rabbeinu Hagona Mechaber Shlita Ari Shegam Ka'ez Shechozer Bo Efshel Limtso Melamed Ragil V'Rak Melamed Miyuchad Kamohu Efshel Limtso. He says, and therefore you have to say that this teacher is arguing you can still find an adequate replacement. So because you can find an adequate replacement, and the only other teacher that you could have found in my stead at the beginning of the year also would have been what we would call an adequate replacement. So I'm not causing you a loss. In other words, it's not that the kids are going to be left without any educator. They'll be left with an educator, but you're no worse off than you would have been had I not accepted the job at the beginning of the year. Because you'll be able to find someone who'll be able to fill in for me, even though he won't be as good as me. That's his argument. The l'chora yesh la'ayin od bazeh. But we have to examine this a little bit further. Shahamalamid lo yuchal lachzor bo midin shu sachur l'rabbi. He says, why can't you argue that the teacher is not allowed to quit because he's considered to be an employee of the public? Tihinei haber hagola kasav ezelashano. Because we do have such a citation. The Ber Hagola writes, Kasvu Hagos Mordechai, Rabim Shehiskiru Malamed, Ein Yecholim Lachzer Bahem. That if the community hires a teacher, the teacher is not allowed to resign. Afal pi sha'adayin lo hischil b'malacha, even if he hasn't started work yet. Im eino motzi lahaskir atzmo b'makom acher, shekol davar hanasa b'fnei gimel ein yecholim lachzer bahem ad kam l'shana. Unless, I guess he could, unless he feels that he needs to change locations. And the reason why he's not allowed to quit is because it was done in a public setting, and anything that was done in a public setting, an employee can't quit when a hire was done in a public setting. In other words, the employer is not allowed to quit, is not allowed to fire the worker, to terminate the contract. Anything that's done, a hire that is done in a public setting has more teeth to it, has more finality to it. And therefore that's a more binding contract. And it works both ways. So if he's hired by the public, in other words, the standard case of a malamed that's brought in the Shulchan Aruch is a private tutor. But if a person is hired as a public teacher, meaning that he's hired to teach a group of students, so then there's more of an argument to be made that he can't quit. V'nira de kamo shehem lo yichlu lachzer bahem kevin shayu rabim shesachru hu hadin shegam ha-malamed lo yichal lachzer bo kevin shu malamed lo rabim. And therefore, just like the employer can't terminate the contract. Neither can the teacher. He says, I'm going to skip the brackets. The Ramah is only that says that a teacher is allowed to quit is talking about a private teacher. He's teaching at the most 1 or 2 students. So why can't we say that the teacher is not allowed to quit because he now has the status of being hired by the community? And anyone that's hired by the community, that creates a more binding contract. So he says there is one possibility. He says, "Ve'efsher dekaven." I'll have to hold it here.